Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. No tourists, always outnumbered, never outgunned, invaders must die, the day is my enemy, the fat of the land, music for the jilted generation experience. There you go, you already knew all of this. Go watch the video I did on STS9's Chromolite, since I put a lot of work into that and didn't expect it to underperform as much as it currently is. They're a really interesting band worth finding out more about. Anyway, that's all I got for this video. Thanks to the Patreon people. That's all for today. See you next time. Okay, I guess I have to put a bit more into this, don't I? I mean, I guess there will be some value in reiterating and further clarifying my opinions on their catalog. This series kind of got unexpectedly deflating for me to put together, if I'm being honest, and getting a full-on copyright takedown for the top 10 list really did not help either. But this was a video that a bunch of people did seem to be genuinely interested in hearing me do, and I don't think there's a lack of possibly interesting discussion material there, even if my actual ranking is obviously predictable as hell if you've seen any of the other videos. So fair enough, we'll talk some more about it. Reminder that these are just my personal opinions. Feel free to post your own rankings in the comments if you feel so inclined. Also, kind of feeling like a change in scenery to make things a bit more interesting. And there we go. How about that? Now there's more trees and stuff. That's something different. So let's talk about... You know, I got a lot of heat back in the day for scoring this in the 5 range, but I might have even been too nice to it in my original video. Like, fans at the time were yelling at me about how I needed to just turn my brain off and enjoy it like the mindless party music that it is. While ignoring the fact that I thought it was failing even on that basic surface level, the ideas going into it were super tired and old hat, like scrapped leftovers that weren't good enough to make the cut for The Day Is My Enemy. The hooks were really weak, and what hooks were there were often really freaking annoying, high boom boom tap, and or relied on chipmunk samples that were really poorly integrated and missed the point of how those worked in the Experience era, Highlight Up the Sky and Time Bomb Zone. The production sounded like absolute dog shit all the way through in such a way that actively cut into the ability for several of these tracks to actually bang in the way they should, lacking a strong enough bass presence to form a solid dance groove and instead just compressing everything to death and reducing everything to meaningless blocks of annoying noises and the vague shape of breakbeat bangers. But most glaringly of all, the whole project had the feel of putting out content for content's sake with little to no genuine passion from anyone involved. This didn't just feel poorly executed to me, it felt lazy. It sounded like nobody involved even gave half a shit, least of all Liam Howlett himself. I wasn't going into this album asking for much out of it. I wasn't expecting anything poignant or smart. I wasn't expecting them to reinvent the wheel or try to do anything that might speak to me beyond that surface level. But I wasn't expecting the results to come off so damn half-assed even by those standards. I will say though, returning to it for this series, having not come back to it a single time since 2018, at least it wasn't way worse than I remembered. The Prodigy may not have been trying on this album, but they do have enough of a floor of quality where I can still see why other people still messed with it as much as they did. Even on a lot of the tracks I don't like, they do still have break beats that go decently hard and act as like serviceable workout music or something to get hype and not pay any attention to. There's a handful of halfway passable cuts such as Need Someone, the title track, or We Live Forever, even if the former being the lead single and deserving to be was maybe something of a red flag in and of itself. And I'll still go to bat for Champions of London being pretty good despite basically being a C-tier pendulum track. At least there's a groove there, and Keith Flint's clearly having fun on that one. I didn't find the experience cringeworthy or off-putting, like I kinda did for the next album in the ranking. I was just bored by it more than anything. If people like or even love this album, that's great, but if anyone can highlight to me what about this album might possibly be better executed than any of their other albums, so as not to put it in dead last in other people's rankings, I'd love to hear it. I can't really envision the rationale myself. Well, okay, I guess it's shorter than The Day Is My Enemy, so if people really didn't like that one, it would make sense for them to rank this above it on those merits. I'll get into my feelings on that one in a bit. But yeah, while this album isn't the worst thing ever, and I get it if you had fun with it, I stand by my feelings that it's not good. It was always doomed to occupy this spot from the start, and if this was all the gas the band had left in the tank before Flint's passing, maybe it's for the best they haven't attempted to come back in the years since. Next. Well, at least with this album, I have a much easier time understanding where its biggest defenders come from. I do get the sense that Howlett still gave a fuck about this one and was trying to do something a little riskier and more out of the box. There is a sound to this album that isn't shared by any other Prodigy album, or any other album period, really. I do think the production and mastering on this album is leagues better than No Tourists, and might even be better polished purely from a mastering standpoint than their actual classics. There are more actual good songs: Spitfire, Girls, Medusa's Path, Shootdown. I really fucking hate the hook on Hot Ride, but I can't deny the actual groove behind that one goes hard as fuck, and I get exactly why other people would love that one. There's even tracks that feel kind of predictive of the places the mainstream electronic scene would go years down the line, like how Memphis Bells kind of sounds like proto-dubstep and proto-trap. But at the same time, I think people noticed that this album also had zero representation on my top 10 songs list when I first uploaded that. Didn't even give it an honorable mention, unless you count me using Girls as the buffer music after I was forced to re-upload thanks to copyright. And I decided on that being the case once I realized I enjoyed every single track on the Fat of the Land more than all the very best moments on this thing. As much as I understand where this album's biggest fans come from, I still just cannot get on board for this thing. I don't like the uses of female vocalists on this album all being portrayed as shallow sex objects and making this thing feeling dated and kinda cringy. I don't like the uses of blatantly on-the-nose samples, like how there's one track built entirely around a sample of Michael Jackson's Thriller that doesn't even try to build upon it or twist it around in any kind of clever or interesting way. I find the tracks themselves are really repetitive and basic and shallow even by the standards of this often shallow and repetitive band, including even some of the good tracks I already mentioned. And there are tracks that get unbearably annoying for me, like Action Radar or Wake Up Call, that make 5 minutes feel like a fucking eternity. My least favorite moments on this album might possibly be even harder for me to get through than my least favorite moments on No Tourists. This album may have been seeing a big reappraisal among the core fans, and I appear to be more in the minority of people who still don't really care for it, even if I think there are plenty of aspects about it that are worth giving credit for. I do not hate the album by any stretch. But, yeah, I can't say I like it either. As far as I'm concerned, there was a reason this project marked the beginning of them seeing a commercial downturn from this point onwards, and I think a lot of its critics were kinda right the first time. Next. Don't really have much to say about this one. It's good. I like it. It does appear to be a common jumping on point for fans who are closer to my age and showed the band could still retain their place in the electronic mainstream that many years after their prime, ever so slightly predating the EDM revolution through the 2010s and really playing well to that particular crowd. There's a bunch of bangers here that are considered classics at this point, like the title track and Omen and Warrior's Dance and Stand Up, among others. Those are my favorites, at least. But all the rest also seem to have at least some fans who really go to bat for them as their favorites, and I think purely in terms of, like, production and mastering, it might be their best polished overall. Oh my god. While being applied to songs that are all easier for me to actually like and aren't trying any ideas that baffled or annoyed me. I still don't absolutely love this album. It doesn't really deliver anything new for the band that they hadn't already done. I don't think the hooks on here are among the catchiest they've ever put together, and I have to actively try to get them to stick in my head. I wouldn't be surprised if I don't end up coming back to it more after this video goes up, but I mean, anytime I do put it on, I enjoy myself from front to back. Fucking hell. That's a big B. So, there you go. Still a good album. I like it. Next. Alright, now, from what I'm seeing, this might be more of a controversial take than I would have expected. I saw a handful of people grumbling about this album in my comments. And you know what? I'd be lying if I said I didn't understand exactly why. I was just complaining about the production on No Tourists, and this album's engineering is exactly as terrible as that one. Just as blown out and over-compressed, with sheer loudness taking precedence over actual groove. On top of that, it's an album adding up to nearly a full hour, with most of the tracks sounding pretty similar. It's a punishing listen in more ways than one. Liam Howlett does offer a couple of cool instrumental ideas. I like the use of the sample interpolation and drum lines on the title track, which come together in an interesting way. I like all the brighter chiptune melodies on Wild Frontier. I like the fact that he added in a random ambient drone type track called Beyond the Death Ray, which is still hype as hell while sounding nothing like any other track the Prodigy ever made. But for the most part, Howlett was totally on autopilot on this album, just making the exact same formula of noisy, hard-hitting banger over and over and over. An instrumental version of this album would be a proper chore to get through. I will admit that my original review of this album may have been scoring it on like a slight curve out of that video being a direct response to Keith Flint's passing. However, I still stand by the fact that this album still works really well for me and borders on proper greatness on the merit of the hooks alone. Keith, Flint, and Maxim pulled double duty to make up for Howlett phoning it in and delivered loads of their absolute catchiest refrains and ideas, where even if most of these tracks are fundamentally the same, they're still able to stand apart from each other on the strengths of those guys' contributions, as well as the guest features like Sleaford Mods or Flex Pavilion. This is such a catchy album all the way through that I can just briefly look over the track listing after not having listened to this thing in several years and immediately recall exactly what every single track sounds like. Nasty, Rebel Radio, Rockweiler, Get Your Fight On, Roadblocks, Wall of Death, these are all functionally the exact same song, but each of them is still really easily memorable as individuals purely because of their hooks and because the guys are clearly having so much fun shouting over them. This isn't just the Prodigy album that most feels like a full band effort instead of a Liam Howlett solo venture. This is an album that the rest of the band single-handedly saved. A really good album that would have been fundamentally broken if Flint and Maxim had not been there. And in my opinion demonstrates their talents in particular better than any other Prodigy album by letting so much of the running time rely on their talents alone and still being such a consistently good time for me. It's not an album I'm going to die on a hill defending. I would totally get it if this was a lot of people's least favorite Prodigy album on the merits of its length, sameness, and dogshit engineering, and or if people just found Flint and Maxim annoying or something. But I gotta give them their flowers on this one. They fucking killed it here. As they also did on... I would be shocked if anyone here doesn't have one of my top 3 picks as their number 1 spot, though which one of those 3 you pick is going to be completely up to your personal taste. Out of those first 3 classics, this one hits the least for me since the crossover with the rock audience appeals less to me than the straight-up rave style of their first 2 albums, and their tendencies to court controversy for the sake of courting controversy haven't aged well, like titling a track Smack My Bitch Up, or including a quote from a literal Nazi in the liner notes. Even if pretty much anyone could easily see through these moves as cheap efforts to get people mad and thereby give them more attention, and that none of that crap was a reflection of their actual beliefs, it's still kind of shitty, and Howlett's attempts to highlight the band's lack of politics just comes off subtextually pro-status quo instead. But none of that really matters or comes to mind when you actually listen to the album and get 10 wall-to-wall classic big beat bangers that everyone already knows well. It was the most popular album in the entire world for a minute in 1997, and met the attitude of that time perfectly, but still effectively holds up now as the shallow but well-crafted banging party music that it is. Flint and Maxim kill it on the hooks just as much as they did on The Day Is My Enemy, but this time Howlett was actually bringing his A-game too, leading to all-time classic bangers like Breathe and Firestarter and Serial Thrilla and plenty more. Smack My Bitch Up, despite the crappy title, is still an all-timer and arguably the band's single biggest signature track, and there's just no skips. A good amount of variety too, with fun instrumentals like Funky Shit and Climatize, or going hip-hop with Cool Keith on Diesel Power, or going more epic and large-scale on Naranjan with Crispin Mills. The latter's vocal performance was never my favorite, but it's grown back on me since I posted my video. There's really nothing bad I can say about the actual music on this album. All of it is a ton of fun, obviously. I just happen to think the other 2 albums are just as consistent, while also preferring what they actually represent in electronic music history, especially seen on... Howlett's attempts to actively distance the band from having any kind of politics in general have low-key kind of made the band's impact in history feel a little more hollow to me. But even if this doesn't represent the kind of people they went on to become, I still appreciate the one time they actually did try to stand up for a meaningful social cause. I mean, it was a cause that affected them in the most direct possible way, the criminal justice bill in the UK cracking down on rave culture. But even if they wouldn't be materially impacted by the bill and only get more popular afterwards, it was still a ridiculous moment in history that was worth speaking out against. Even in the shallowest way of saying fuck 'em and their law. Having a rave album that actively leaned into the image of reactionary politicians had made for them of rave culture being violent and dangerous to the status quo only made them seem even cooler. And they had all the bangers to back themselves up. All-time classics like Voodoo People, Break and Enter, Speedway theme from Fastlane, Poison, No Good Start the Dance, and more. Even getting marginally more experimental, like with the whole Narcotic Suite at the end, which might be my favorite part of the album. This thing is really long, it might not have hurt to edit it down a bit, but they keep delivering the hits from start to finish, so I can't really complain too much. I was even very briefly starting to consider putting this at my #1 spot out of my having kind of overplayed experience a bit while making this series and thinking this might be close enough in quality to overtake it. Although again, after my top 10 list got an automated copyright takedown for using a 5-second clip of Invaders Must Die as the buffer music, it did kind of remind me of the band's hypocrisy and refusal to engage with the content of what they were saying in a way that was all the harder to ignore. I know the YouTube copyright system is completely automated and that the band likely had zero involvement in what happened to my video, but I mean, if there's a reason I've been framing this video with the level of reverence that I have. If you couldn't tell, I am slightly kind of fucking done with these guys. Almost started to make a moment like their law feel like they're equivalent to like Kanye West saying George Bush doesn't care about black people. Like a powerful moment at the time, but we have to look at their later track record and think, well, how intentional was that really? But again, even if there is something cheapened by knowing Howlett doesn't really believe in what it truly meant, I'm still choosing to believe he at least meant it at the time, only to change his mind after getting super rich led him to become more conservative leaning, just like so many other successful Gen Xers of his ilk. Regardless of that, this is still an unequivocally great album whose impact can't be denied and still holds up as a classic to this day, and whose impact on the culture I'd say is only overshadowed by... And yeah, probably the biggest contribution I feel the Prodigy have to the culture is helping take rave music to a more mainstream audience while presenting that culture 100% authentically without watering it down. This is an album that feels like what UK raves were really like to be in 1992. Or at least so I'm told. I'm American and I wasn't alive yet in 1992. But it still so easily transports me to that time and place and scene in such an effective way, unmatched by any other album, really. I guess Orbital's Green album comes pretty close, but this is better. Like I said, I did listen to this album a bit too many times while making the series to the point where it's lost a little bit of its impact for the time being. There's only so deep I can really go with it. But it's still unquestionably the album that I have the most fun sitting through from start to finish, and the one that most appeals to my core sensibilities. So many fantastic hooks and samples and earworms flying at you every second. So many breakbeats hitting at just the right trunk-rattling frequency to urge your whole body to move alongside it. The perfect balance of crazy, hard-hitting bangers like Fire and Jericho and Everybody in the Place and Death of the Prodigy Dancer, with stuff that's sillier and jokier like Wind It Up and Charlie, to even occasionally adding in a slight hint of more emotional weight like on Your Love or Weather Experience. And then, of course, there's Out of Space, which is arguably all three of those categories at once. I'm not going to say the album's perfect by any stretch. I would totally get it if other people didn't have this one ranked so high out of finding the gratuitous chipmunk samples annoying, even if this is one of the few albums where I think that kind of effect is actually implemented well. I would get it if people just resonated more with the heavier tone of their later material or thought this was too silly to get into. I would even get it if this ran together a bit for some. There's plenty of 90s dance albums that have more variety or more substance to dig into, but this one really defined the image of what 90s UK rave culture was all about, and I'd frankly argue this album is the realest and most authentic to who the band really were at their core. Like, all the macho posturing on later albums was cool and all, and Keith Flint and Maxim did a great job of selling that without even making their masculinity all that toxic, and equally welcoming everyone to go ham with them regardless of gender or race or any other background. But this is a band who, at their truest, deepest core, never wanted to have any kind of greater purpose except to dance and party and stuff. And I think Experience presents that in a more pure and unfiltered lens than anything else they ever did, and that's some real shit. It's just all-time great dance music and nothing else. And sometimes that's all you need. So there we go, that's the ranking, and that's all the Prodigy discussion I'll be doing on this channel. Next video I have in the pipeline is another much bigger and more in-depth ranking video for a completely different band that's been almost 2 years in the making now. Excited to finally get that out in the world. And as for the next discography review, I'm going to keep that a surprise for now. I think y'all will like it. It's a pretty historically important outfit. But if you don't, then it'll at least be like an even shorter series than this was with just 4 videos. So yeah, look forward to that. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.